was really well made, though.
It was really well made.
All right, folks, it says that we are streaming live now on Facebook. Wonderful. All right, so welcome everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a very special, very timely virtual panel discussion to talk about the film by director Erica Cohn, Belly of the Beast. If you have not had a chance to see the film yet, you can still join in on the conversation and stream the film later on our website. That's filmstreamsathome.org. My name is Angie Balserini. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for Film Streams. We are a mission-driven nonprofit dedicated to the presentation and discussion of film as an art form. With our 2 cinemas temporarily closed, we've had the opportunity to explore different and hopefully creative ways to fulfill our mission and continue offering our community programs. And our longtime partner, tonight we're so grateful to be partnering with IB Black Girl. We've got a brilliant panel of women here for this discussion. I'd like to do some quick introductions, and I'll also have our panelists dive into a little more detail about themselves, their work, and the film. Just a quick reminder that for those in the audience watching live on Facebook, please put any questions that you may have in the comments section. Our very own Brenton Gomez will be looking for those and making sure that we have a chance to answer. Okay, so let's get started. Ashley, we'll start with you. Ashley is a bold leader that actively works to create just and equitable communities. In her work as a community organizer, philanthropist, and activist, she champions racial and gender equity in hopes to create sustainable system change. She is a graduate of Jackson State University, where she studied communications and marketing, then attended University of Texas, Arlington for her master's program in urban social planning. She has spent the last decade of her professional career working in spaces from organizational development to philanthropy. So Ashley is also the founder of IB Black Girl, IBBG for short. It's a collective that supports Black women, femmes, and girls to grow, give, connect, and take action. IBBG has outsized impact since inception in 2017, like investing nearly $200,000 in Black women, femmes, and girls. In 2019, Ashley was chosen as an ABFE Connecting Leaders Fellow and is one of 10 philanthropic professionals nationally selected for this opportunity. She is also an inaugural 2020 Black Futures Lab Policy Fellow and proudly serves on the ACLU of Nebraska Board of Directors. Ashley, we're gonna go to you first. You can tell us a little bit more about IB Black Girl, but just first impressions of the film.
Yeah, so I think most importantly, and thank you for reading my bio like that, but my work is really centered in building power for a community. So how can folks have the resources they need, choice, decision-making, and influencing opportunity to do whatever it is that they need to do, how they define success, how they define reaching and accessing their full potential. And so IB Black Girl specifically centers that same approach, but specifically at the intersections of race, Blackness, and then gender womanhood. And so for this film and the first impressions, like I knew what it was about, like when we agreed to do this, but just how impactful the storytelling was and how they humanize this conversation that I think we have had the opportunity to engage in, but not at this level. And so there is a privilege that I have specifically to be able to access and talk about what we're talking about tonight, right? Like I can watch this documentary, I can do research. IB Black Girl is going to be leading a campaign around maternal and infant mortality and health. And so like I have that privilege to do that, but to see the women that are most impacted that don't have as much access into this space still organize, still be affected, like still go through all these things. It was upsetting and I was infuriated like I normally am, but then I was also like, man, these women of color are dope. Like inside of a prison that is meant to destroy you, organizing and advocating for yourself, like it just speaks to just the resilience and beauty and richness of who we are, as well as the structural inequities and disparities that don't allow for us to access and reach our full potential. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
Initial thoughts. That's like some deep stuff that I want to get into right now. But okay, let's finish. Thank you.
We'll come
back to that. Pause. Thanks, Ashley. So our next panelist is Jasmine Harris, Director of Advocacy and Policy at RISE. She has 12 plus years of experience in nonprofit program management, community engagement, and coalition building. Most recently, Jasmine served as co-founder and CEO of Waymaker LLC, which is an organization that motivates women and girls to overcome setbacks from being involved in the criminal justice system. She also served as a health educator at Creighton University and as civic engagement committee chair for the Urban League of Nebraska Young Professionals, where she focused on advocacy and awareness around criminal justice issues. Jasmine received a bachelor's in biology from the University of Nebraska at Omaha and a master's of public health from the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And in 2017, Jasmine was awarded the Omaha NAACP Freedom Fighter Award and was named one of the 10 outstanding young Omahans by the Omaha JCs. So awesome. Everybody give a shout out for Jasmine out there in the audience. And Jasmine, tell us a little bit about you and your initial thoughts on the film.
Thank you so much, Angie. I hate having my bio read. Again, I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at RISE, and we're a nonprofit that works with people who are incarcerated and coming out of incarceration. And what my focus really is on policy change at the state level, even at business levels, things like that, really creating that awareness around the barriers that people coming out of incarceration face, and even before incarceration, as we're looking at what continues to feed the system of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. When I first saw the trailer for the movie, because I hadn't heard of it, I got, like Ashley, I got pissed off watching the trailer, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to be a part of this panel. I just need to see the documentary. And so as I started watching it, I was just typing as I was watching it, because I was like, what am I feeling in this moment? Because it was just so much. It was like Ashley said, it's so powerful, enraging, but yet at the same time inspiring to see how the women did organize. It also really shone a light, if people didn't pick up on it, why women are incarcerated to begin with. A lot of women, and the trauma that they go through in life, and how they end up dealing with that trauma is why they're incarcerated. And for me, that's something that we don't talk about a lot, and how we can start really impacting how women end up in the incarceral state because of trauma that they're going through in their daily lives. It also got me to thinking about all of the medical distrust that people of color have in the United States, and how this just continues to perpetuate and the cycles keep moving. And by the end of it, I was like, man, can we get a lawsuit? Like, oh my gosh. Like, I just want more out of all the work that has been put into it. And it was just so much. And I also thought about the preying that these doctors did on these women, and it was very shameful. So it was a lot of emotions and thoughts that went into this. So I'm looking forward to having the discussion tonight.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, Jasmine. And then last, absolutely not least, often more than once contributing, we rely on ACLU a lot for these conversations. Scout Richters. So Scout graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a Bachelor of Journalism degree in 2011. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Brooklyn Law School in 2014. During her time in New York, Scout worked as a legal intern for the National ACLU's Women's Rights Project. Scout's student note on using the Constitution to expand access to oral contraceptives was published in the Brooklyn Journal of Law and Policy in 2013. Upon returning to Lincoln after her law school graduation, Scout completed a postgraduate fellowship at the ACLU of Nebraska. Prior to joining ACLU of Nebraska as legal and policy counsel, Scout was an attorney. Scout was a staff attorney at Legal Aid of Nebraska and worked primarily in Lancaster County Juvenile Court in juvenile law violation and abuse and neglect cases. Scout, thank you so much for being here with us. Tell us a little bit about your first thoughts of the film.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here with Ashley and Jasmine. I'm big fans of both of you. So yeah, so at the ACLU, I focus primarily on women's rights, reproductive justice issues, and juvenile justice issues. And like you mentioned, working at the Women's Rights Project and also looking into the issue of birth control access in my student note really inspired me to realize like I could make this kind of work a career. I feel very fortunate that we at the ACLU get to use not only like litigation, but we also get to use policy, advocacy, public education to make changes. And I think what really stuck out to me that really just, I don't know, it kind of like hit the main themes right on the head was when Kelly was testifying and she said, did this happen to me because I'm Black? Did this happen to me because I'm a woman? Or did this happen to me because I was incarcerated? And it's like, yes, yes, yes. And I just think it really, really showed how important it is to realize the intersectionality of all these issues and, you know, thinking about reproductive justice as, you know, it's not just about abortion, it's about being able to make the decisions in your own life. And I just thought that the way she said that was just like very powerful. And it just really showed like, bottom line, this is why this is happening to her and to all these women, so.
All right, we're gonna dive in, you guys. So my first question, and we'll have just another reminder to the audience, please submit anything, any questions that you want. We've got 3 brilliant women on this panel, ask them whatever, but I will start us off. So I think right now, people are talking more about eugenics and sterilization because of what's happening with the whistleblower complaint out of the ICE detention center in Georgia. Scout, you might know some specifics about that. But even with that story, I think that the people's reaction is like, oh my God, I can't believe that's happening. You know, like here in the United States, that's like something that's never happened in this country. But it's like well documented in this country. So can we talk a little bit about the history of, and maybe even if you know some specific Nebraska state history of forced sterilizations, eugenics, like where did this start from?
I can just give a little like dates and a little facts that I kind of uncovered after seeing this documentary, because obviously it got me very interested to know like what is happening right here in Nebraska. So it looks like the Nebraska law that authorized sterilization procedures passed in 1915 and was it continued on until its repeal in 1969. And in 1968, the year before it was repealed, this Cavett case was heard by the Nebraska Supreme Court, basically upholding sterilization of a woman who was in a facility and saying that it was constitutional because she could remain at this facility without being sterilized. And so it was just a condition for her parole or discharge. So like it wasn't actually compulsory. That's what the court said in 1968, which just shows like, I mean, yeah, it was a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. So, I mean, Nebraska has its own history, definitely with sterilization, and a lot of obviously problematic things that accompany that. So
I think too, for me, it's important not to allow only these very viral, like really massive instances, like guide us in like us being super alarmed, right? And so like, yes, we know that it happens. The documentary talked about that Germany came over to look at the California-based eugenics program, right? Like, but that's to me is like very viral in your face. But I think that there's a lot of within these systems, eugenics-based practices that we see every day in and out of correctional facilities or within the criminal punishment system. And so for us, it's like, how do we engage in these conversations on a day-to-day basis and use policy, advocacy, organizing as all these different levers that need to be pulled so that doesn't happen. So we, as I mentioned at IB Black Girl, are going to be launching a campaign around some policy initiatives, but just awareness in general around maternal health. And what does that mean when we center specifically Black women? We know that we are the most affected by a lot of these inequities. So if you center us, that there's ripple effects for everyone. It was a Black woman who blew the whistle in the facility, right? Like, so Black women, we are the energy and essence, and we will be centered in this work. And it was just interesting going through and building this campaign because to your point, Scout, like when we talk about reproductive justice, that language is not even accessible in itself. So what we're talking about really is how does housing, transportation, to Jasmine's point, intimate partner violence, right? Like all of these things that surround us limit our well-being and impact who we are and the things that we want to achieve as it relates to our reproductive system and not. And I think that's what the film really showed is that that history and that nuance and that complexity, because again, we saw that it started with, she was a nonviolent offender, Kelly, and because she defended herself from intimate partner violence and years of abuse and trauma, she got 15 years, right? Like there was no bonding and relationship building with her kids while she was incarcerated, like all of these layers and these layers and these layers. And so for me, reproductive justice and what we're talking about is not just in this instance, but the film really showed how every day we really have to engage in this conversation and address all of these systems that allow for this to happen.
I totally agree with that, Ashley. I'm also looking at when we're talking about people saying, oh my gosh, how does stuff like this happen in the United States? Or I can't believe it happened here. We have a history of weaponized genocide. And that's what I think of eugenics as and this sterilization, because we have seen the continuous systems and blatant racism and everything that's happened to try and eliminate our people. They are deliberately separating families. When we're talking about mass incarceration and all the African-American men who are in prison, I see that as genocide and eugenics as well. Because if you're separating, you're therefore trying to kill off the future generations and things like that. So I think it all comes into effect. You know, we have to come to grips in terms with how things are done in this country. And to what Scout was saying about some of the Nebraska history behind it, I go researching too, pulled up kind of that same information. And in between 1917 and 1963, there were 902 people who were sterilized in the state of Nebraska through this law, but they were 80% were because they were mentally deficient or mentally ill. That was the claim of it. And we know when they shut down those mental health facilities, the prisons became the largest provider of mental health care. So it's the same people who we are seeing that they sterilized back then who are being pushed into these systems now. And they may not even necessarily be mentally deficient or mentally ill. That's just the labels that they're getting and not being treated for things that are treatable. So therefore you have all of this, like you said, layer upon layer of things that we have to dig into where this eugenics is happening. And I think it's a history of weaponized genocide across the board.
that leads like right into this other question that I have. So can you tell us, maybe explain to the audience why issues of reproductive justice largely affect Black women, women of color, First Nations, and in what ways is it tied to white supremacy?
I would say for us, so specifically, we are looking at Black women, so I'll speak from that perspective. We know that it does affect women of color, but it's the intersection of anti-Blackness, racism, and patriarchy. And so we cannot divorce our race and culture from our womanhood and our gender identity. And so when we talk about womanhood, that includes femme-identifying folks and specifically trans Black women as well. And so since we can't divorce those identities, you see that layered approach on what does patriarchy look like and the inequities there, sexism, so on and so forth, racism and anti-Blackness. And so what we found in our research in building this campaign specifically around maternal health and doing some work with the Women's Fund around repro justice, we know that we're losing choice in our birthing rights. And what does that look like? And so forced C-sections, which they talked about there, not having access to birth control and other means. And again, it's one piece of this for us is looking at the actual health if you have a uteri, but then it's also the other surrounding system. So do I have safe and affordable housing? What is my economic status? Do I have the money to be able to pay for my prescriptions? Do I have paid leave that I can take off to raise my, like all of these things play into the health and the well-being. And so I think it absolutely fits into what you see in white dominant culture and supremacy. And so for me, it's really about how do we take this information, make it accessible and co-create with community. So I know from my seat, what I would say needs to happen around maternal health and repro justice, but that doesn't mean that that's the experience of every Black woman, girl, and femme, or what community is saying needs to happen. And so we're really trying to make a grassroots initiative, and we're leaning on experts in the field, as well as everyday folks who have these experiences and stories to say, what does this look like if we build a multifaceted movement that centers us and our perspective and our recommendations? And now we can use our privilege and power as a collective to say, we're going to call on you, policymaker, to change this. And we're not going to let up till you do. Like our healthcare system, UNMC, we need to see the data. The data's not good. Our foot is going to be on your neck until you do. Like that's our role in being able to do that. And so we hope that folks from all identities and can really engage in that and rally behind this, because we know the importance that it will have into the well-being of all community.
And I thank you, Ashley, for talking about that centering. That's one of the things that I really loved about this documentary, that it centered the women who were affected. It wasn't the white savior complex coming through, and it's it was us. It really brung and centered the women who were affected, and I think that's what people really don't see and is missed a lot, especially when we're saying, why are these issues of repro justice largely affecting Black women and women of color? Because no one cared to even think about it at first, and so now it's like it's being brought to the forefront, like Ashley was making mention of. And we're talking about maternal and child health. Black women die at a higher rate during childbirth. And if someone didn't bring that to the forefront and the light, no one would have known and no one would have cared. And that person was Serena Williams. So she had, having that platform to bring that to light. And so
you think about how much money Serena has and access.
Yeah. And that's a privilege, you know what I'm saying? Those privileges we talk about and the access to the healthcare, but it still affects us. And the doctors don't listen, and no one believes it. Oh, what she said, the doctor said I was in the film. She said the doctor said I was a hypochondriac. Like those are the things that Black women and women of color face. They don't want to listen. There's nothing wrong with you. It's in your head. Again, going back to that mentally deficient and mentally ill piece of it. And this has been going on for ages upon ages. We look at when slaves were brought over and being subjects of these doctors when, trying to figure out what does the reproductive organs look like and things like that. So it's just always been hard for Black women and women of color when it comes to trying to even having bodily autonomy and being able to say, you know, this is my body, this is what I want to do with it, what I can do with it. And I think it's just now being brought to the forefront that it affects us more than anything. So that's why it's like really in everybody's face.
And you think too, Jazz, to add to that, like the field of, you know, OBGYNs and what does that look like? The father of that field, right, operated and experimented on Black women that were enslaved. And so what we're talking about is absolutely tied to supremacy and racism, and it's super embedded into the DNA of our country and in all of these systems. And to your point, Jess, how you mentioned like the mistrust within the healthcare field, like it is so layered and so nuanced. And if we did the research and pull all the data points, like we could lay it out and here are the facts. And so like, how can we take those, reconcile with the history of our country and our community, and then move to a place that really supports and centers Black women, girls and femmes, and women of color in this movement?
And one other last thing I'll say on the theme of centering that really stuck out to me was there was a scene where I think Cynthia had called Kelly and was like talking about, oh, are you going to share your story? And, you know, encouraging her, like, we need you to testify. And Kelly, you know, was like, well, I have to do it. But, you know, people with lived experiences are the ones that have to, like, every time we talk, we have to share our story, this trauma comes back out. And it's something that, like, at the end of the day, the legislators and the advocates can go home, and I have to be here living with this. It comes up again, but she knows that she's going to help people by doing it. So she still does it. But I just thought like that was super real and something that I think, you know, organizations and ACLU, we struggle with centering voices in a very authentic way so that it's not like, you know, causing more trauma and like not leaving someone abandoned after they do share their story. So like, I just thought the way she said that was very impactful, I guess. And I just think as far as like reproductive justice, like the movements, it's like the mainstream movements historically have just focused on like keeping abortion legal as a choice and things like that. But it's like for people of color and Black women, it's like, what good is this choice if we have no way to access this? So like, I just, that was one thing that came up for me too. So.
If I can add, Angie, really quick, I know you have probably some more questions, but Sister Song is a great national organization. If y'all, for the audience that's out there, and a good resource, again, Black woman led, that really started the conversation, is leading the conversation around repro justice. And they have a lot of great resources and approaches and templates as well. And then to the panel's point about centering, I loved how they have women that are on the board of the organization and incarcerated and not incarcerated. And they talked about moving all leadership to being women that were formerly incarcerated that have these experiences. So I even love the intentionality of not tokenizing, but saying, how can we make sure folks are ready for the opportunity, have the tools needed, and support them in transitioning into this work. So.
Yeah, that was awesome. So I kind of want to turn the conversation, Jasmine, you were talking about this bodily autonomy and how women, specifically women of color, Black women, have struggled with that. And I want to ask, even from like, not just a moral perspective, but also a legal perspective, when people are imprisoned, is there such a thing as choice or consent? You know, I mean, like, do they have the capability of giving consent for anything that happens with their bodies? Legally even, I don't know.
Jazz, you gonna answer that, or do you want Scout to start?
I was saying the Scout was gonna answer with the
okay, sorry. We should have coordinated. So definitely, people who are incarcerated have right to refuse medical care, but obviously severely restricted as compared with someone who is not incarcerated. Prisoners and those incarcerated can refuse like testing and treatment for some conditions, but they can't refuse that for things that threaten the health and safety of the facility. And so there also are instances where they actually need to, they're forced to accept treatment that is necessary to protect their health from permanent injury. And so obviously this is, nothing that would justify this practice that was shown in the film, but that's just kind of like the basic legal framework.
Yeah, I would say no. I know Senator Kavanaugh, was it last year, 2 years ago, put out her bill around the shackling of incarcerated birthing folks, and what does that look like? And so I think in general, when you talk about the prison industrial complex and like this punishment system, it does remove the dignity and humanity of the folks that are inside. One of the ladies, and one of the nurses said this, and I put this in my notes as I was watching, like, I need to remember. And she said, humans get numbers, and that makes it easier to abuse them. And so I think that's across the board. And my good system best friend, Dominique Morgan, and the work that she does with Black and Pink, she really has talked about that and used her number and talked about the transition of how that was given to you. What did that mean to deteriorate your humanity, and how she has taken back power in that and use that to transform and try to abolish the same system that tried to destroy her. And so I feel like the Black women and women of color that we saw are savvy, brilliant, and amazing. So they found ways around that, but inherently outside of the like legalities and words that Scott were talking about, I would say no, like they've removed that, and that's not the intent and purpose of any of these systems.
And how I look at it as it's just, you're choosing between a rock and a hard place. What kind of choice is that to even have? We hear all the time that people incarcerated have access to healthcare that is just as good as healthcare on the outside. And we know that's not true. When we're sitting here watching this documentary and you're talking about a doctor who's sitting there eating a sandwich while providing healthcare, OBGYN healthcare at that. Hands aren't washed. There are other stories that we hear about prison doctors who aren't highly qualified to do the things that they're doing. So what kind of choice is that? If you have to get healthcare and it's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And then I look back at me going through the graduate program and having to do IRB, institutional review boards, and how they are so strict when it comes to researchers wanting to do research with people who are incarcerated, and the rundown that these individuals have to go through in order to get this approved. And you're supposed to have consent from the individual and things like that. So when I'm looking at the documentary and we're talking about people who were drugged during birth, signing papers, I equate that when we're talking about rape. If she is, or if they are intoxicated, they can't consent. So it's the same thing, and it just really sickens me to see that these are grown adults who have medical degrees, who are in positions of power, manipulating and scheming against people. And
yeah, exactly. So there was a nurse in the film whose face was blacked out, who essentially says she doesn't know whether sterilizations in prison should be illegal or not because it saves the state money. And then Dr. Heinrich, the OBGYN at the Valley State Prison in the film, said to the Center of Investigative Reporting that forced hysterectomies are cheaper than welfare. What is your response to people upholding this system?
I think it was interesting, and Jasmine made this point earlier about the intersecting inequities that we see and the reoccurring theme of a welfare queen and how that has a Black or brown face, that it's mothers incarcerated, running up tax dollars and all these things. And I know for a fact that if there's a safety net program, they're not going to keep it because it's benefiting Black and brown folks. So we are not the majority on this program. And again, it's ideally an opportunity to help launch and help folks, because we know that there are different levels of access and opportunity based on your identity. And so just this reoccurring theme of a welfare queen, even the notes from on the Facebook and the social media of this story that was published, and that's what people were talking about. And you think, what policy and cabinet was that ideology born out of? So again, these ideas of racism and patriarchy are embedded and they are reinforced through all these different systems. So then someone now decides that are in a position of power and authority, that we are othered. We're not good enough to make a decision about having a family. We don't deserve to have a family. So they're going to make that decision for us and remove our choice because it saves taxpayers, white taxpayers, money, right? And it makes the world a better place. And so I just thought the beautiful nature in which they brought up these really horrible narratives and weaved it together to show this larger picture of how this stereotype and prejudice and bias reinforced decision-making at an institutional level was very brilliant, and how they showed that and showed how we have to address systems at all angles in order to see change.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I thought when the nurse was saying that. Like, this is so ingrained in people. You were sitting there talking about you working in here, and if you would have known what was going on, and you would have, did whatever. But then you turn around and say, well, it does save money. At the end of the day, this is about policing bodies. We have the same people who talk about don't get abortions. But then when these children are born, and because the parent wasn't able to take care of them, now they're a burden to state dollars. You know what's going to save the state some dollars? Stop incarcerating women. That's what's going to, save the state some dollars.
And that's, to me, the real, stop putting women in, if we start there and start to address that, then it would have a ripple and domino effect. Absolutely, Jazz.
Well, exactly. And Scout, I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about the percentage of women and femmes that are incarcerated that, just like Kelly Dillon's story in the film, it was basically she shot and killed her husband in self-defense. So how many women incarcerated are there for self-defense or have been victims of abuse and assault?
I think, first of all, the vast majority are there for nonviolent offenses. They're there for, part of this whole broken windows policing is targeting low level drug offenses that maybe, not majority women, but more women than higher level drug offenses. So vast majority are there for nonviolent offenses. Those that are there for violent offenses, largely intimate partner, much like Kelly Dillon's situation. And then I'd say, the vast majority have either substance abuse, mostly from trauma that they've experienced before. So it's all, I can't tell you the exact number, but very, very, very few violent offenders. And I hate to even say that, because it's even with violent situations, it's we still need to ask, how does that justify locking someone up? No, in certain cases. So.
There is, I used to do a presentation on sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And there's just not enough data collected. And this was looking at young girls, teenagers, and how they intro into the systems from that. And these like were upwards of 75, 80% of these young girls who were in these youth facilities were there. They have been sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused. It's all that trauma that's there. And if you have 75 to over 80% of those individuals who have gone through this trauma, it just continues to be with them as they grow if they haven't received any help with it. And I'm quite sure when you get to the women's prison, it's going to be a higher number of who's all there who's been through this kind of trauma.
And some of that trauma is happening when they're put in juvenile facilities, and it just builds and builds. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, tell me about like right now in our Nebraska state prisons. I mean, I thought that there were, I was reading about some overcrowding issues that we have. Like what can we as this, community do to kind of combat or bring attention to that? We have somebody that was asking on the Facebook page too, just like some actionable things as people in our community.
I would go back and again point to Black and Pink, again, the work that Dominique Morgan and her team are doing around abolishing the criminal punishment system and reimagining what does restorative justice look like, right? Like what brings and reconciles the harm that's been done with that person and who did it, the person that was on the receiving end, into community. Like Jazz mentioned, removing folks from community doesn't help because this individual is still someone's mother, brother, sister, friend, neighbor. And so when you think about holistic killing in community around what we're talking about, we have to start with the issue at hand. Is the number of prisons that we have. Building new prisons are not the answer. I know Danielle just put out in the chat on Facebook a report that the ACLU just published around what Nebraskans are saying we want, and that's not new prisons. The answer is really addressing why are we putting folks in these systems? Is it because they need treatment? Is it because we really need to address the economic insecurity of families and communities and the embedded racism of why folks ended up with these choices? And so I think we have to have a larger, more nuanced conversation about this to really address then the implications of racism that we're seeing within mass incarceration.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that too. It's one of the things that RISE does. We bring in that empathy piece because that's what's lacking, especially when people are coming out of incarceration and back to the community. When those Facebook things were popping up on the documentary, people like, oh, I agree with this. It's the same when people are coming home from incarceration or something happens, like, oh, they're criminals anyway. Oh, they don't deserve. And, it's the same kind of that negative attitude that people in the community has. And when I think one of the comments on there was like, good for them, at least we won't have any more criminals born. But let's not go there when you can come from a great family with great money and still have criminals in that family. So it's not that. And I think that's one of those, that piece is that empathy, but we also have to look at it from the standpoint of how we're getting people into the system anyway. And like pointing to what Ashley was saying, what are those underlying issues and how are we looking at those to prevent people from going into the system? The affordable housing, the employment, livable wages. You're talking about transportation to and from these jobs, access to healthcare, access to mental health. Stop criminalizing mental health and substance use. Like you said, majority of these people are in for nonviolent offenses because they have a substance use disorder that came from more than likely trauma that they're trying to overcome or undiagnosed mental health. So we have to start really looking at what are those underlying issues and why are we putting people in these systems to begin with?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Jasmine, that you brought up that empathy piece, because I feel like how do we spark that in people? And I mean, I believe, but I work for Film Streams, I drink the Kool-Aid, whatever, but it's the power of film, right? Like can spark that in people. So I don't know, like we can talk about whether or not you think the film and bringing these women's stories to the light would ultimately, like, do you think film can bring about change in the system? But also real quick, my buddy, do you guys know Chantel Mallory?
Yes, we love Chantel. Hey, girl.
I know. So she submitted a question. What is the impact of these same practices on femme and female juvenile folks who are incarcerated?
I want to maybe before we tackle Chantel's question, at least for me, go back to your question, Angie, around film. I think it takes all these levers within a movement to be pulled to create change. So how can film bring about stories? How does policy help? How does advocacy help? How, like, how are we looking at all of these different tools and activities that really address core root issues? And so I don't think it's one thing. We're going to need everyone pulling all of these at the same time, dedicated to this long-term commitment for this work for us to see change. And so I love how film and art allows for that to happen. This is also Trans Awareness Week. And so shout out to Ange Bennett, who posted and made a coloring book around awareness. And what does that mean for young folks to get that and the conversation that'll be had in family, or for older folks to get that and see it and be able to really talk about what trans folks are experiencing and how we better support our neighbors and friends that are trans. And so I think art allows for storytelling and awareness to happen in a different way and allows for engagement. So I am super excited that this film was brought to Nebraska by you all. And if y'all haven't seen it, watch it. You can still stream it. It's good. It's you're gonna have to have some trigger warnings and get yourself together because we all are navigating a lot. So be prepared before you go in. However, I think it really will be transformational in how you view reproductive justice and the criminal punishment system, and what does that look like for women of color.
And most definitely, I knew what the film was about before I went in, and I'm still triggered and had tears all over the place. I was like, good gosh. But I think the question was like, does it create the change with the film? I think it evokes the empathy piece in people if they sit down and really watch it. And I think that gets their minds to turning. But like Ashley said, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just going to be one thing or the other. So it's like when we're talking about policy and how even in the film, when they were down testifying at the hearings, is that you can't just come with the data. You have to come with the stories. You have to give it a personal face for people to be able to look at them in their eyes and see what it has done to someone. Because somebody can sit there and like they'll say, people don't even come to the senators don't even come to their own hearings. They sit there twiddling their thumbs and act like they're not listening and things like that. But when you put someone in front of them, they have to start paying attention and listen. And so I think the film then gets people's minds going like, okay, that's eye-opening. How can we now start mobilizing around it? They want to get more involved. And I think that's the brilliant part of it, is getting people to now say, how can I remove my blinders and get more involved and not just think it's those people over there. And I think it starts adding up to the small wins. For me, it's not going to change the system itself until we can get rid of the system. It's just going to continue to adapt. There's always going to be something else that comes, and we have to try and get rid of the system altogether. People always say the broken system is like, it's not broken, it's working the way it was designed, and that's what's wrong with it.
And I think just jumping off of that, from Ashley and Jasmine, seeing the film and sparking that empathy and then bringing it to Nebraska. So like maybe this kind of sterilization isn't happening necessarily in Nebraska, but we have like the film talked about how, you cut your finger, you get a pap smear, you get a pap smear. Similar, I think, in Nebraska is any kind of ailment that someone has, they just say, drink more water. That's the answer to everything. So like, it really opens the door to think about some of these things that are definitely related and may not be exactly what happened in the film, but like it opens the door, I think, so.
And I don't think Nebraska is exempt. I know folks like to feel like, that happened over here. Same when the Ferguson effect happened, right? Like that could never happen here. And we had James Scurlock.
Yes.
So we are not exempt from these types of instances of abuse and genocide, as Jasmine mentioned. And so we have to really start to examine all of our systems and how we show up in these systems to perpetuate this harm, specifically that's affecting communities of color. And in this film's instance, Black women and other women of color.
So we're close to, we've got 10 minutes left, guys. So
this went so fast.
I know. I could just do this all night and talk to you guys. But so we have a couple of questions. Keisha Sarpong says, I didn't even think about the correlation of certain figures not wanting to adopt certain programs because they know what these programs will be utilized. Really bringing me to think about how currently the governor won't accept free money for Nebraskan residents to feed their families during the pandemic and who that is crucially impacting. So I guess less of a question, more of a comment. Do you have any comments back for her regarding that? Also, Clarice Jackson, let reentry help and not hinder successful reentry. So those were a couple of comments, not questions.
And we had Chantel, I'm watching on my phone too, so I can talk to people while we're doing this. And Chantel said, don't forget her question. So do you want to go back to Chantel's first?
Oh, yes.
You know, she's an attorney too, honey, so she's quick with that tongue. So we need to go on and answer and dialogue with her.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll repeat Chantel's question. What is the impact of these same practices on femme and female juvenile folks who are incarcerated?
Scout, did you find any data as it relates to that as you were searching?
I did not find anything specific, and that's really interesting. That's.
And I was just thinking about that too. With that, like with us doing women and girl work, it's the data doesn't exist for Black women and femmes in general. So that's one of our asks and our recommendations of how can we get the data to help inform this story. But then looking for folks that are considered minors, the complexity of getting that data and what does that look like. And so I think Chantel brings up a great point of if we know that a lot of the cycles of trauma and abuse start early in childhood, like we're seeing with the school to prison pipeline, so on and so forth. How can we start the advocacy a lot earlier? And so I think that's a good call to action, you know, of how do we center young folks in this conversation in their experience and not just when it's at the tail end of what we're seeing. So thank you, Chantel, for that call to action, raising that point.
Yeah. And we know that as of like 2013, I think Nebraska has one of the like 5th highest incarceration rate of girls. So like that's a really good call to action. And
I was going to say with the Health and Human Services work on the juvenile facilities out in like Geneva and things like that, like that's where that information should probably really dig into. I know they had a lot of packages, policy packages passed this past session on revamping how those facilities are running and things like that. So I really think that is a call to action to make sure that they are keeping a thumb on that kind of work or what's going on there, because they are impacted. I think we were talking about one of the bills that came up in judiciary this year was like the mother-child program. And being able for the women who are incarcerated, if they have their, if they birth their child while they're incarcerated, being able to provide breast milk. Mm-hmm. And once the child leaves, still being able to pump and provide breast milk. And someone said, well, how would this work with the juvenile system too? Because we have young girls who have babies while they're. So yeah, I think that's a call to action to make sure that that information is being captured.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of the times there's just, asking in other areas, asking for like open records. Unfortunately, it's like a lot of times they're just like, well, we don't really have a policy. So like, that's something definitely that we can look into.
One more comment from Clarice, the intersectionality of youth of color and reading is a major issue. It's the suction cup to school to prison pipeline. and I feel it's educational malpractice, specifically for Black males. You know, Ashley, we did not too long ago a collaboration about Push Out, which I think is like a really, you did a great job talking about that. Do you want to kind of like?
Yeah, so Push Out is a film by Dr. Monique that looked at the school to prison pipeline and how girls, Black girls, she has the book, are over disciplined in school. And she is now actually the executive director, first executive director for Grant Makers of Girls of Color. And so an intermediary organization that's putting and pushing out dollars for this kind of work that's similar to her research. And I think for us, again, from IB Black Girls stance, is when you center Black women, femmes, and girls, everyone will benefit because we're the most that are, we are the most impacted by these disproportionate numbers and inequities that we see at the system level. ACLU has a great report about school resource officers. You know, they started ideally to protect from mass shootings based out of Columbine, the massacre that happened there, which was a tragedy. However, what we see now is that school resource officers are disciplining our students. They're over policing Black and brown kids, and now they're getting records in third grade. Tanette Powell is another great example. She was living here in Omaha. She's now in LA, and she did a story in her research and was on CNN and has really built a portfolio in the school movement around the over disciplining of Black males and Black students in general. And what does that look like? And so I think, again, we can see the intersecting nature of all of this. And what does that look like? And how do we start to address and attack racism that are embedded in our systems in order to say, this is what this looks like here, and this is how it's rippling in to this issue over here.
I remember early on when I was doing substance use prevention work, there was this guy that came and talked from LA area, and he made this comment which blew me away. And it's to Clarice's point, is like they build prisons based off of the reading levels of third and fourth graders, African-American men. And that right there is critical in how education is important at that early of an age. If people are keying in on that and saying, this is how many prisons we need to build. So I think there's a lot of work when you're talking about the literacy rates and things like that, making sure that our children are literate.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes. You guys, I want to be super respectful of your time because I feel like I always ask a lot from you. You all.
And Nas is gonna bust back in. He's like, "Mama, you've been gone too
long." So I just want to thank you so much for lending your expertise to us in this conversation tonight and getting the word out about this film. If I could. Last favor, just a call to action, that like something that people can, who are watching in the audience, some people that are gonna look at this later on our YouTube site. What is something actionable thing that we can do in our community?
Who wants to go first? I think Scout's going.
I can go. Sure, I'll go. I think just becoming like I obsessively, because it's part of my job, I obsessively track bills on the Nebraska legislature website and see when there's hearings. And I think people can celebrate the victories that we have had. So like the Senator Kavanaugh's anti-shackling bill is one that was mentioned, ban on solitary confinement for vulnerable populations, including pregnant women. And then, so celebrating those small victories. And then I think just becoming aware of the issues that we do have, and we still have a long way to go, obviously. So I think just familiarizing yourself with those and not being afraid to engage with your personal state senator or someone who, another senator who may be more amenable to these issues than your personal state senator. So I think just not letting it be something that is happening in California, but just transferring those feelings of that you felt from the documentary and bringing them to an issue here in Nebraska.
Yeah, I was going to lean towards that same kind of concept. If these are things you're really passionate about, things that you're interested in and want to see movement on, holding your elected officials accountable for the decisions that they're making at those levels. I know it's not as actionable as people want. People want something to like get down and do. But when we're talking about policy, I tell everybody it's a long game. It's not going to be short. It's those small wins that Scout was talking about, that because we have to build up to those bigger ones because people move so slow and their mindsets move so slow. So I think it's just really continuing to keep these issues at the forefront and holding those elected officials accountable and get behind those organizations that are BIPOC led, that are really doing the work, who have people there who really understand the issues, and putting your efforts in with them.
Thanks, Jasmine.
I would say first, I'm glad to be on this panel with y'all. It's been super great to spend time with each of you for this hour. And shout out to all the orgs that were dropped in the chat too. Like, make sure that y'all follow up with them if you're watching now or watching later. And I would say my call to action would be to give resources. So your money, first and foremost, money, and resource, to Jasmine's point, Black women and women of color that are leading this work. We are underfunded. We do this and bootstrap with our own money. I can tell you now, we don't get paid at Ivy Black Girl, but we are leading large campaigns and partnering. Like, resource the people that are doing this. So even if you're not sure if you're interested in it, you think you kind of care, that's cool. You don't send $50 every month. That's all we need. So resource us so that we continue to do the work that is most important, because we are most impacted and we bring our expertise and our lived experience to the work. So we know that it's going to be transformational and have outsized impact if we're able to do what we need to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. My call to action is share this film talk to two of your friends about this film and the issues in it, just in the next month.
Oh, and you can do like a virtual watch night, right? And watch it and then talk about it.
Like instead of a book club, yeah.
Yeah, start a book club.
Virtual movie club.
All right, thanks so much, you guys. This has been an awesome conversation. And to our audience, thanks for being here. And we'll see you later. And Brenton can shut us off. I don't know if he...